There was a time when Britain owned the skies. Our engineers invented the jet engine. Our factories built the future. Then in 1957, a politician decided that manned aircraft were finished, that missiles had made them obsolete. What followed was not modernization. It was the dismantling of an industry that would never recover. In the years after 1945, Britain stood at the summit of aviation achievement. The sound of Merlin engines still echoed through our memories, but we were already building something beyond propellers. Frank Whittle's jet engine roared to life in the Gloucester Meteor, the only Allied jet fighter to see combat in the war. De Havilland engineers sketched the Comet, the world's first jet airliner, on drawing boards in Hatfield. At Wharton, the English Electric Lightning was taking shape, a pure interceptor that would climb vertically into the sky like a rocket with wings. The names rolled off the tongue like a prayer. English Electric, Vickers Armstrongs, de Havilland, Hawker, Avro, Bristol, Blackburn. Every town seemed to have a design office. Every factory floor hummed with purpose. Fathers showed sons how to rivet aluminum skin onto titanium frames. The smell of hydraulic fluid and jet fuel hung in the air. We were not just building aircraft. We were building proof that Britain still mattered in a world where empires were crumbling. Farnborough Air Show became our stage. Every September, the world came to Hampshire to watch British engineering perform miracles. The Lightning's vertical climb left American observers speechless, their checkbooks already open. The Vulcan bomber, a massive delta wing painted brilliant white, howled through the sky in maneuvers that should have been impossible for something so large, elegant and deadly. These were not just machines, they were statements of intent. We had emerged from the war not weakened, but strengthened. But beneath the spectacle, cracks were forming. We had over 20 aircraft manufacturers competing for a shrinking pool of government contracts. English Electric fought Vickers. Hawker competed with de Havilland. For every requirement the Air Ministry issued, multiple companies built prototypes, splitting limited research budgets 20 different ways. The Americans were consolidating into giants. Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed, while we maintained a cottage industry of brilliant but fragmented firms. Each protected its own legacy, each refused to collaborate. The innovation was extraordinary, but the economics were catastrophic. By the mid-1950s, something was shifting. The Suez Crisis of 1956 had decimated Britain's finances and humiliated its military. The cost of maintaining great power status on a shrinking budget was becoming impossible. Then in 1957, Duncan Sandys, the Minister of Defense, published a white paper that would become infamous. His argument was simple and brutal. Ballistic missiles were the future, manned aircraft were the past, and Britain could no longer afford both. The age of the fighter was over. What followed was a massacre of dreams. The Saunders Roe SR-177, a mixed-power interceptor that combined a turbojet for cruise with a rocket motor for spectacular climb performance, was killed. West Germany had been desperate to buy it until Lockheed bribed officials to purchase the inferior F-104 Starfighter instead. When the German order vanished, so did the SR-177. The prototype sat at Cowes, nearly complete, waiting for an order that would never come. The Avro 730, a stainless steel marvel designed to cruise at Mach 3, was scrapped before the first prototype flew. Engineers watched as acetylene torches cut apart the fuselage they had spent years building. The metal went for scrap. The knowledge of high-speed flight went to America, where it would inform the SR-71 Blackbird. The Fairey Rotodyne, a revolutionary vertical takeoff airliner that could land in city centers, lost government support. The tip jets generated 113 decibels of noise, loud enough to stop conversation 2 miles away. But Fairey engineers believed they could solve it. They never got the chance. The funding stopped. The project died. Did Sandys understand what he was killing? Did he realize that by stopping these projects, he was not just saving money, but scattering the teams who knew how to build the future? Every cancellation was a dismissal notice to the best engineers in the world. Every abandoned design was an invitation for them to take their skills elsewhere. In 1960, the government decided to fix the fragmentation with force. Duncan Sandys made it clear. Contracts would only go to consolidated entities. The firms had no choice. Mergers were not negotiated. They were imposed. English Electric, Vickers Armstrongs, Bristol and Hunting were forced together to create the British Aircraft Corporation. Hawker, de Havilland, Avro, Blackburn, and Gloucester became Hawker Siddeley Aviation. Teams that had been fierce competitors for decades were suddenly expected to collaborate. different drawing office standards, different engineering philosophies, deep mutual suspicion. The chaos was immediate. When BAC started work on the TSR-2, the airframe was split between English Electric at Wharton and Vickers at Weybridge. Engineers who should have been working together spent their time fighting over whose methods were superior. Delays multiplied, costs spiraled. The very consolidation meant to save the industry was poisoning its most ambitious project from within. The TSR-2 was supposed to be Britain's answer to the nuclear age, a low-level strike aircraft that could penetrate Soviet air defenses at 200 feet, traveling at near supersonic speeds, delivering nuclear weapons with pinpoint accuracy. Its terrain-following radar was years ahead of anything America had built. Test pilot Roland Beamont flew the prototype XR-219 in September 1964 and reported it handled beautifully, exceeding every performance prediction. Then in 1965, the newly elected Labour government cancelled it. The reasons given were cost. The programme had ballooned from £16 million to nearly £100 million. The real reason was politics. Lord Mountbatten, Chief of the Defence Staff, was a Navy man who despised the RAF's expensive toys. He famously declared he could buy 5 Buccaneers for the price of one TSR-2. Defense Secretary Dennis Healy believed he could purchase the American F-111K swing-wing bomber for less money. The decision was made, but cancelling the TSR-2 was not enough. The government ordered the destruction of everything associated with it. Already built airframes were taken to Shoebury-Ness and blown apart with explosives. Production jigs were cut up for scrap. Tooling was destroyed. The speed of the destruction was extraordinary and deliberate. A scorched earth policy to ensure no future government could reverse the decision. Of the aircraft built, only 2 survived, XR-220 at Cosford and XR-222 at Duxford, both damaged, both silent monuments to what we threw away. The P-1154, a supersonic vertical takeoff fighter, was cancelled the same year. The HS-681, a futuristic jet transport, followed it into oblivion. In their place, Britain would buy American. Except the F-111K turned out to be a disaster. Development problems plagued the aircraft. Wing cracks, engine failures. When the pound sterling was devalued in 1967, the cost of the American order skyrocketed. In 1968, Britain cancelled the F-111 purchase, paying steep cancellation penalties. We had destroyed the TSR-2 to buy the F-111, then cancelled the F-111, leaving the RAF with nothing. The waste was staggering. The humiliation was complete. The bitter irony came next. The RAF, which had rejected the Royal Navy's Blackburn Buccaneer as inadequate, was forced to adopt it after all. The Buccaneer was not foreign. It was entirely British, designed at Brough in East Yorkshire, built with de Havilland and Rolls-Royce engines, equipped with boundary layer control for carrier landings. It was a triumph of British naval engineering. But the RAF had insisted it needed the TSR-2, something faster, something more advanced. Now with the TSR-2 destroyed and the F-111 cancelled, the RAF had to humble itself and accept the Navy's aircraft. The Buccaneer served with quiet competence for 2 decades, proving what the RAF had refused to admit. Britain could build world-class strike aircraft. We just kept cancelling them. In commercial aviation, the tragedy played out differently, but with the same conclusion. The de Havilland Comet, the world's first jet airliner, should have dominated the skies. Instead, it became a cautionary tale. In 1954, Comet flights began falling from the sky. Metal fatigue, radiating from the corners of square windows, was tearing the fuselage apart. The aircraft was grounded. The investigation took 4 years. De Havilland engineers solved the problem. They redesigned the windows, thickened the skin, and launched the safe Comet 4 in 1958. But by then, Boeing had studied Britain's published accident reports, learned from our mistakes, and launched the 707 with rounded windows and a stronger fuselage. The 707 could carry twice as many passengers. By the time the Comet 4 returned to service, the race was over. Seattle had won. Concorde was our last defiant roar. The Delta Wing supersonic transport was a technological masterpiece, the result of a joint British-French program that pushed the boundaries of aerodynamics, materials science, and engine design. It flew at Mach 2. It crossed the Atlantic in under 4 hours. It was beautiful. It was also an economic disaster. Only 14 production aircraft entered service. The 1973 oil crisis made the fuel-thirsty Olympus engines ruinously expensive to operate. Sonic boom restrictions banned supersonic flight over land, limiting it to oceanic routes. Airlines that had placed orders quietly cancelled them. British Airways and Air France operated Concorde at a loss for decades, sustained by national pride rather than profit. When the last Concorde flight landed in 2003, it marked the end of an era, but it did not mark the end of British commercial aviation, no matter how much it felt that way. In 1981, British Aerospace launched the BAE 146, a 4-engine regional jet designed for short runways and noise-sensitive airports. It was called the Whisper Jet for its quiet engines. It could land at London City Airport where other jets could not. Over the next 2 decades, 387 aircraft were built and sold around the world. The most successful British civil jet program in history. It was not Concorde, it was not the 707, but it proved Britain could still design and build competitive commercial aircraft when the economics made sense. The problem was that by then, the world had moved on. Boeing and Airbus dominated the long-haul market. The regional market was crowded with Canadian and Brazilian competitors. The BAE 146 was profitable, but it was a niche product in an industry where scale was everything. When production ended in 2001, it felt less like a failure and more like a quiet acknowledgement of reality. Meanwhile, the engineers were leaving. After the 1965 cancellations, American recruiters set up offices in London hotels, interviewing British aerospace engineers and offering them jobs in Seattle and California. They went in their hundreds. Former BAC and Hawker Siddeley designers worked on the Boeing 747. The swing-wing technology developed by Barnes Wallis for the cancelled Swallow project informed the American F-111 and F-14 Tomcat. The knowledge we had spent decades accumulating was scattered across the Atlantic, lost to us, gained by them. Walking through the old sites today is an exercise in mourning. Hatfield, where the Comet was born, is now a business park and university campus. The runway is gone, paved over, replaced by housing estates. Street names like Comet Way are the only hints of what once stood there. Kingston, where Hawker built the Hurricane, the Hunter, and the Harrier, is now a residential complex called the Hamptons. Plaques mark where the design offices once stood, but the buildings are gone, demolished to make room for apartments. Filton, home of the Bristol Britannia and the Concorde, still hosts aerospace work. Airbus designs wings there, and Rolls-Royce maintains facilities, but the runway closed in 2012. The final assembly of complete British aircraft has moved elsewhere, scattered across European consortiums and international partnerships. The romance of watching a finished jet roll out of a British hangar painted in RAF roundels or airline livery, built entirely by British hands, is gone. Some will argue the industry survives. BAE Systems is one of the largest defense contractors in the world. Britain builds sections of the Eurofighter Typhoon, the front fuselage, the canards, the Rolls-Royce engines. We are the only Tier 1 partner in the F-35 program, building 15% of every Lightning II that rolls off the production line anywhere in the world. The industry has shifted from whole aircraft integration to high-value systems integration. The expertise remains. The profits remain, but it is not the same. The Typhoon is not a British aircraft. It is a European consortium project assembled from parts built in 4 countries. The F-35 is American, designed in Fort Worth, Texas. With British components, we contribute, we participate, we no longer lead. The days when Britain could conceive, design, build, and fly a complete aircraft from a single factory, the Lightning, the Vulcan, the Harrier, are over. Did it have to end this way? Imagine if Duncan Sandys had supported the industry instead of dismantling it. Imagine if the TSR-2 had been allowed to finish development and prove itself in service. Imagine if the government had invested in solving the Comet's problems faster, keeping our commercial lead. Imagine if consolidation had been managed carefully, with respect for the different engineering cultures being forced together, instead of imposed by ministerial decree. We had the talent, we had the technology, we had customers around the world who wanted British aircraft. The Lightning was better than anything America had in 1960. The Buccaneer served with distinction for decades. The Harrier jump jet, developed by Hawker Siddeley without government support, became one of the most successful V/STOL aircraft in history, sold to the US Marine Corps and serving in the Falklands War with devastating effectiveness. These successes proved the potential was always there. We just kept cancelling it before it could flourish. Britain's aircraft industry was not killed by fate. It was killed by choices. The choice to prioritize missiles over manned aircraft in 1957, the choice to force mergers without proper planning in 1960, the choice to cancel the TSR-2 in 1965 for political expediency, the choice to buy American instead of supporting British. Each decision seemed rational at the time, driven by budget constraints and Cold War pressures, but cumulatively, they destroyed an industry that had been the best in the world. We lost more than factories and jobs. We lost the knowledge of how to build complete aircraft. We lost the pride of watching something British take to the skies, knowing every rivet and wire came from our workshops. We lost the dreams of young engineers who wanted to design the next Spitfire, the next Lancaster, the next generation of British excellence. They went to Seattle instead. They built the 747. They made America great. Walking through those empty sites, past the plaques and the renamed streets, you realize what we threw away. Not just an industry, but a piece of national identity. The belief that Britain could still do great things, that we could compete with America and win, that our engineers were the best in the world and our aircraft were the finest in the skies. Some of those old aircraft survive in museums. The Lightning at Duxford, the Vulcan that still occasionally flies at air shows, its howl echoing across the decades. The TSR-2 at Cosford, forever grounded, a monument to cancellation. People visit them and wonder what could have been. What did you remember about British aircraft? Share your stories below and suggest topics you want us to explore.